If you are searching for the deeper truths in the kingdom of heaven, and you have a desire to understand the mysteries contained inside the temple around the divine feminine, this episode is for you. Welcome to In Her Image, a podcast where we seek and celebrate Heavenly Mother through scripture, scholarship, and everyday life. I'm your host, Meg Riminick, and today we are going to be talking about the temple, the tree of life, and even, believe it or not, Lord of the Rings, as I bring on Dave Butler, a Hebrew transliterator savant who has dedicated himself to understanding temple literature in sacred texts. I hope you will enjoy this episode and that it will lead you to the same conclusion that I've come to, and that is that Heavenly Mother is the pinnacle of the temple and the center of everything.
Let's try entering this a way I've never entered it before. It's interesting to notice that the temple as described in the prose sources in the Old Testament, and as that's to say Exodus, the tabernacle, and in Kings and Chronicles, where Solomon builds the temple, 1 Kings 6 and 7, 2 Chronicles 3 and 4. The temple makes a kind of a journey or a sequence, and the sequence ends in darkness, because as described, the final room of the Holy of Holies, the Holy of Holies is the final room, or the oracle, or the Debir, has things in it. There's a rock there. It's actually not described in the Old Testament, but it's described in other ancient sources, and we it's still there. So we have photographs. We know it's there. There's a big kind of, it's interesting. There are sort of grooves and slots cut into it, and we don't know what they were for, but it's there in the mosque now, the Dome of the Rock Mosque. You can look up this rock on Wikipedia. Okay, so there's a boulder. Sitting on top of it was the Ark of the Covenant. Maybe there were also two big cherub forming a throne. That's it. That's what's described as being inside. Okay. There's no light. All of the action as described in the Old Testament, all days of the year but one, happens in the middle room or in the courtyard outside. Okay. There's an incense altar in the middle room. There is a table. There is a lamp that is said to be there. That's where the light is in the prose sources. A 7-branched lamp that is described in Exodus as a tree with leaves and fruit and branches. And the priests come in there and they burn incense. This is what Zechariah is doing when the angel Gabriel appears to him beside the incense altar and tells him his son is going to be he's going to have a son. Right, and his son will do the work of Elijah, and then only one day a year the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, and it's the Day of Atonement, and he goes in there to carry the sacrificing blood of the goat and the bull and throws it on the Ark of the Covenant, and then after the Ark of the Covenant was gone, so in the time of Jesus there was no Ark there. It's actually quite mysterious what happened to the Ark. But the Jews at that time treated the rock the ark had sat upon as if it were the ark. So they went in and threw the blood on the stone, right? So it's a dark cave, and this is what happens in the dark cave. And that's the only thing that happens in the dark cave. And that's not the way LDS temples work. Well, in an LDS temple, you pass through a veil into light. Not just light. But you can find these images online, right? Go look for images of an LDS temple online. What else do you see in, we call it the celestial room, okay? But in this sequence, it is the Holy of Holies. What do you see? Well, you see repeated motifs of vegetation, light, and water, okay? You see plants, super common. It's sort of a cliche. It's a temple architecture, a temple decor cliche. The floral arrangement underneath the chandelier. Or you see it also in the plaster on the walls. You'll see some temples will have like leaf motifs, leaf and branch motifs. Or in the stained glass, you'll have You'll see branches, right, overhead sometimes or high in the windows. Which is it's interesting, and I think not very much commented upon this stark difference. And one of the first indicators that should tell us there's something going on, there's a mystery here. It's a mystery to which we have some big clues as to the answer, is the fact that even though the prose accounts in the Old Testament describe the temple as a tunnel that ends in darkness, there are visionary accounts in the Old Testament, but especially in the New Testament, in the Book of Mormon, that indicate that the journey's not supposed to end in darkness, that the journey ends by a tree. And in fact, that's interesting. That suggests that maybe, although the prose accounts tell us that the tree that is a lamp is in the middle room, maybe it wasn't always there. Maybe it was believed that in some time it would not be there. Right? The true order it has the tree and the light at the end of the journey. Right? So Matthew 7 is an example. But what happens is that is mapping the journey through the ascent into the place where the tree is. Okay. So the straight and narrow gate leads to life, is what Matthew 7 says. And when you're actually through the straight and narrow gate, the thing you see is a tree with good fruit. Okay. Similar. So that suggests that for the evangelist Matthew, okay, the temple journey ended passing through a veil, but not apparently into darkness, into the presence of a tree with good fruit, which sounds like the tree of the lamp that the prose sources put in the middle. By the way, Lehi shows us the same thing in 1 Nephi 8, where this is an ascent, and we may come back and summarize these discussions, but for now, let me just say this is an ascent through the temple, and it ends in following a straight and narrow path into the presence of literally a tree with good fruit. First Nephi 8:10, Lehi sees the fruit and says, I saw that it was desirable for making one happy. Okay. Which, by the way, this is super interesting. I think this is in verse 30, First Nephi 8:30. When people enter into the presence of the tree, they fall down. Okay, they fall down. So this is, by the way, also a book of Revelation. So John sees at the end of the book of Revelation, I'm going to talk about Tolkien in a minute. This is going to be fun. At the end of the book of Revelation, Jerusalem is restored. It is a perfect temple. And the chapter 22 shows us the Holy of Holies. We know it's the Holy of Holies because it has the throne of God, which is the ark. And it has water flowing out of it, which it's the same as the visionary waters of Ezekiel, or the rivers of flame in the book of Enoch. There may have been water piped in. Scholars think that the Gihon spring water may have been piped in to explain why there are so many water images in the poetry associated with the Holy of Holies. Okay. In any case, in the visions, there's water. So the throne and the water tells us that's the Holy of Holies. And there is the tree of life with its 12 fruits, and its leaves that are good for healing. Right. So again, John, Matthew, Lehi / Nephi, they all know this temple order where the Holy of Holies is the place of the tree. Nephi tells us, 1 Nephi 11:25, that he went and got a vision, saw the same tree his father saw, and specifically identified it as the tree of life. Okay? So if we weren't already thinking this has something to do with the Garden of Eden, that should tell us this all has something to do with the Garden of Eden. Now, by the way, it's super interesting to think about, again, if we go back to the prose accounts of the Old Testament, okay? And we back out from the Holy of Holies, we pan back with our camera, back out to the porch. And the only thing that appears to be on the porch, the first room of the temple, is 2 pillars. And the pillars are described as having lily work in the Old Testament. Okay, which is to say they are arboreal. There are leaves on these pillars. There are descriptions in, oh boy, I'm going to get this wrong. I think it's in both Josephus and the Mishnah. We could find these, but there are old Jewish descriptions that say that there was a vine in the front, across the front of the temple, across these two pillars during Herod's time. And that people would bring uh, agricultural offerings like bunches of grapes, and they would hang them on the vines. Now we don't really have a description in the Old Testament of bringing your agricultural offerings. So like this is one of many indicators that there was more happening at the temple at the time than was left to us in a record, right? But think about that. There are two columns with leaf work on them at the beginning of your journey. And there is, you go on a journey, and in the end, you come into the presence of the tree of life. 1 Nephi 11:25, tree with good fruit of Matthew 7, and 1 Nephi 8, the tree with the healing leaves of John or Revelation 22, right? Well, if the tree at the end is the tree of life, what are the two trees at the beginning of that journey? It's a good question. Let me share with you. Surely you are a great reader of fantasy literature, and in particular J.R.R. Tolkien. But if you are not, let me summarize some interesting things about Tolkien. If you only know Tolkien through the films, one of the things you probably don't realize is what a thoroughgoing Catholic Tolkien was. Okay, his parents died when he was young. He was raised by a monk. One of his sons became a monk. He was a go to mass every day of the week with his boys Catholic. Okay. And his books are profoundly Christian. So it's really interesting that if you put his Silmarillion, which is kind of Tolkien's Old Testament, and his Lord of the Rings, which is kind of his New Testament together, the Silmarillion starts with the image of the Garden of the Gods in Valinor, and with two trees. And the two trees are attacked by a giant spider. And then at the end of the story, after Sauron has been destroyed because the ring was cast into Mount Doom, Aragorn, who is the rightful king, descends into the White Mountains because the tree of Gondor is dead and must be restored. And he finds a sapling that of the tree and brings it back and restores the one tree to its rightful place. So this Tolkien's work starts with two trees and ends with one tree, just like the Bible, which in the Garden of Eden has a tree of knowledge of good and evil and a tree of life. Okay, and then ends Revelation 22 on the tree of life. So I think that's the journey being mapped out in the architecture. I think on the porch, you are in Eden, but you're in Eden at the beginning when there are two trees, a tree of knowledge of good and evil and a tree of life. And then there's a journey, and Solomon's temple makes it a three-part journey. And we can get, sometimes that's broken into more parts, but I think that we can see it in its essence with like three, nice and clear. And part three is that you're back in Eden again. And now there seems to be only one tree, and it is the tree of life, which by the way, Genesis 3. Here's a fun fact about Genesis 3. Okay. So when the old Jewish scholars in Alexandria, this is in Egypt, okay? This is during the so-called Second Temple periods. This is like 300 years before Jesus. There's a Jewish community down in Egypt. By the way, this is pre-rabbis by about 400 years. So they're not Jewish in the sense that we know Jews. They're ancient Hebrews, right? And they translate the Bible into Greek. And the old Greek translations is super interesting because sometimes it shows us fun stuff like the following. So in Hebrew, in Genesis 3, Eve gets two names. Her first name is woman, okay? Man and woman, which, fun fact, That's how Jesus addresses Mary Magdalene in the garden when Mary comes and finds him after the resurrection. So at the end of Jesus's journey, he is in a garden speaking with Eve, and he is the gardener, which makes him Adam. Now, that's a whole other conversation. So,
but a good one I want to have at some point.
yeah.
That
So
sounds amazing.
we'll get there. So in Genesis 3, right, the second name is as they're getting booted out, Adam gives Eve a name and says, I will call her Hava, Eve, for she is the mother of every high. Now that is actually interesting for various reasons. Okay. Um, One, it doesn't say she's the mother of every living human. It says she's the mother of every living thing. Okay. Two, Hayot, the living things, show up in a lot of interesting places in the Old Testament. In Ezekiel 1, they are the cherubs, and they form the throne. Is Eve the mother of the cherubs who formed the throne? That's super interesting. Also, there are passages in the Old Testament, Isaiah 56:9, I think, is one of them, that can be read as saying that Shaddai, which is an old divine name, which for reasons sounds feminine, Shaddai has Hayot, has beasts, has living things, right? So there's all these kind of interesting questions about the Hebrew. The Hebrew is not even the part I want to talk about, right? But the point is, Eve, whoever she is, right? Whatever she is, seems to be the mother of all living things, including maybe the cherubs. Okay. But it's a pun. This is a pun. Hebrew, the Bible is all puns. Okay. You have to like puns if you're going to read the Bible, because if you don't, you miss half of the action.
And you have
So
to
I will call
understand
her,
the puns in a Hebrew form or you miss it completely,
yeah.
right?
Learning Hebrew is the basics, is step one. That is correct. I'm sorry. That's hard. That's a hard truth, but it is the truth. Um, you'll get there.
Maybe someday.
Maybe someday.
Will you teach me?
So maybe someday.
Okay.
So he says, I'll call her Hava. She's the mother of every high. That's the same root. Okay. He's punning on the name. So what happens when they go to translate this into Greek? Well, the Greek scholars look at this and they go, the important thing is the pun. So to preserve the pun, they change Eve's name. So in Genesis 3, all of a sudden, and this is not true for the rest, like Genesis 4, she goes right back to being called Ewa. Okay, that's how it's transliterated into the Greek. But in Genesis 3, Adam says, I will call her Zoe, for she is the mother of the zoonton. Okay, I will call her Zoe because she's the mother of the living things, the zoonton. Well, that's interesting because Zoe means life. So in the same chapter, the tree of life is the tree of Zoe. It's Zoe's tree. So in Greek, if you were just a space alien, okay, where you were raised a Chinese communist with no idea about what any of this stuff meant, you learned Greek, you'd never heard of Christianity, and you just sat down and read the Greek account, you would go, oh, the tree belongs to Eve. Eve is somehow owns the tree, right? Because the Greek seems to say so. It's Zoe's tree. I will name her Zoe.
Can we pull the thread on like helpmeet and that Hebrew word only being used? I'm not a Hebrew, but do you know this, Ty, of that Hebrew word only being used one other time to refer to Yahweh being the helpmeet
I've
to
had
David?
several people try to ask me to tell it to them, and I don't know it, and they can't point me at the verses, so
frustrating.
I don't know.
And this is why I need to learn Hebrew.
That is correct. Then you would look it up yourself.
Yes, exactly.
I think the word is neged, which is in fact, I shouldn't say I think. I can just go look. Let me pull up Hebrew Old Testament here. But I think let's get into Genesis 2, right? Genesis 2. So let's see. You don't know offhand where the verse "help meet" is, do you?
Not offhand, but I can look it up real quick.
Oh, here it is, 218. Um, yeah, so it's neged, which I think is opposite, like in the sense is like counterpart, his counterpart. But I think maybe I'm not sure, and I think you maybe are not sure either, is I will make him so neged it says negdo, meet opposite him, meet for him, his peer. I think it's the word ezer you're talking about. Selo ezer, I will make him a help. Um, I don't know. I do not know which of those words is thought to only refer to Yahweh. I mean, I know that Ezer is the word that's in Ebenezer when they erect the here I raise my Ebenezer, right? That's that word.
Mm.
Um, so I'm sorry. I've the strike one, two more and I'm out. Um,
What, David? You don't know all things.
I know. You might be surprised how many people want me to just comment on random subjects, and I have to say how often I have to say I just have no idea. It sounds like fun.
Yeah.
You go.
Yeah.
Um, so so look, so I think there's without even having gotten into it much, I think there's a lot of reason to think that the temple journey, as understood by Matthew, as understood by John and the Nephites, as it should be understood by us and as understood by somebody in Old Testament times, but apparently not the people who were writing down the descriptions of the temple,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's like a whole big subject that is some people have very hard time accepting and get mad at me about. Okay. Um, but according to some set of people, the temple seems to be the place of the journey out of Eden and back to Eden, right? Out of
Right.
Eden and back to Eden. Um, where the tree is who heals. But first Nephi 8 and 11. Okay. Um, and this is Dan Peterson noticed this in an article like 25 years ago. Big props to Dan for pointing this out. But Nephi asks, well, Lehi sees a vision of the tree with the fruit that's desirable for making one happy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Nephi says, I want to have a vision. So he prays, he gets a guide. Apparently, two guides over the course of it. Apparently, the guide changes halfway through. And he says, I want to see what my father saw. And he gets a vision of the tree, which his father saw. And Nephi says it's white and beautiful. And the angel says, and what was that? And he says, I behold that you shown me the tree which is precious above all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Nephi recognizes the tree. It is white and beautiful. Lehi does not say that. I think Lehi says the fruit is white, but Nephi says the tree is white and beautiful. And Nephi identifies it as precious. And this is interesting because two chapters later in our current chaptering, Nephi talks about how the plain and precious things are taken out of Israel's biblical record, which we ought to sort of connect with the idea, oh, maybe this has something to do with why there appear to be two different temple orders known in Israelite scripture, right? In particular, since the tree is the most precious thing, there's something sensitive or tricky about the tree. So he sees the tree, it's white and beautiful. It's precious above all. And Nephi says, I want to know the meaning of the tree. So then he gets a vision. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the vision shows him, first of all, Jerusalem, um, which is interesting. We can come back to that. But then it shows him a virgin who is white and beautiful. And then shortly after that, he sees the virgin again, and she's holding a child. So somehow the answer has to be the tree with fruit that is white and beautiful is, which Nephi says is precious above all, is the woman he calls virgin, who is white and beautiful and is holding baby, and the baby is the fruit.
Right.
Okay. And sometimes we say, oh, that's Mary. That's Mary. Well, it's not Mary, because 10 verses later he says it's the tree of life. Mary is not the tree of life. Okay. Except insofar as she participates in larger divine things. So, so instead, what it appears to be is that Nephi knows that the tree of life is the divine mother of the divine son.
Mm-hmm. So the same
Now,
woman that they talk about in Revelations 12, right? And that whole story is
very
that.
likely the same woman that is talked about in Revelation 12, very likely the woman that is talked about in Isaiah 7, where the prophecy is not, behold, a virgin shall conceive. The prophecy in Hebrew and Greek is very clear. It's, behold, the virgin shall conceive, and his son will be named Emmanuel, which is God is with us. So the virgin, so somebody who we know, right? A known quantity whom you and I both know as the virgin,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or else that makes no sense. The virgin is going to have a son. The son is God,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, what is the ultimate background of this? The Old Testament is the record of Israel encountering and struggling with God, in multiple senses,
Right.
trying to choose righteousness over sin, fighting with each other over different ideas, fighting over what's going to go in the record, okay, fighting over who has access to the resources. God was very contentious for these people, okay?
Which is because they were contentious, right? They're reflecting a God that mirrors who they were being during that time.
It is interesting that the Old Testament, as it comes down to us, endorses genocide. So that suggests that whoever edited it and got it to its final form, somewhere on the way, people who were perfectly comfortable massacring their neighbors had a hand in producing the Old Testament as we know it.
Right.
Okay. Again, this is in that space where some people are going to be very uncomfortable when they hear me say this, and they're going to say, "No, Dave," but
it's true.
it should make you uncomfortable.
It should make you uncomfortable when you read it. And I mean, for me, it's not a God that I know that they're talking about most of the time.
It is
right?
clear. So it is clear that Israel, well, let's say Judah, the kingdom of Judah, it is clear that the kingdom of Judah and probably Israel had a goddess. This is not contentious. Everybody agrees. Okay, there was a goddess. We know her archaeologically. We know her name. It's in the texts. By the way, Nephi and Lehi both pun on the name. Okay. Israel had a goddess. She seems at the beginning to have been understood as part of a family that was a trio. So this is Mark S. Smith, is a Ugaritologist, and in his book, The Early History of God, talks about this, and he quotes Genesis 49, the blessing of Joseph on this to sort of is how he gets there. What is a Ugaritologist, Dave? Okay, so Ugarit is a Canaanite city-state, except they actually didn't call themselves Canaanites. That one of their documents, they have a list of who are the foreigners in the city, and it says there's Canaanites here. So they didn't see themselves as Canaanites, but they were a city in the land of Canaan. At the farthest end of Canaan from Israel, but that's not very far. Like this whole all of this thing, like the whole thing can happen in Rhode Island. Okay, it's not a big place. So near Israel and close to Israel in time, there's this city called Ugarit, and in 1928 we found all their records because they wrote on clay and baked it. And there's a guy out farming in Lebanon, and he hit a library. Okay, so we have this library of documents from Ugarit, and there are people who do Ugarit studies for its own sake, but also it is one of the tools that in the 20th century scholars came to use to help understand the Old Testament more. Because suddenly some phrases that were used to describe Yahweh that had not made a lot of sense suddenly made sense because you could see the background was in Ugarit. And some of the Psalms looked a lot like they'd been borrowed straight out of the Ugarit liturgy for the king, right? And you're like, oh, so this has, we see Israel's nearest neighbor in time and space, and it helps us understand Israel. And that helped us see that look, in Ugarit, you had El, who was a father god, and Asherah was his wife, and they had a son, Baal, who was kind of like the active one. He was doing all the stuff. He was the god of the king. Okay. And it looks like that is the original religion of Israel. El, Asherah, mother and father. Asherah is the mother, El's the father. And then Yahweh, who had a lot of the same titles that Baal did, rider upon the clouds, for example, that was the son who was specifically, he was the god of kingship. And over time, as part of this like fight, the people who edited the Old Testament sucked everybody else into Yahweh. So all of the sort of the epithets, the titles, the blessings that the mother and the father had given just became part of the son. And he's not the son anymore because like there's no mother and father. He's just Yahweh. He always was. Okay.
Right.
But notwithstanding, this is what happened in the text. We know that Asherah, the mother, specifically, continued to be popular at all levels. So we know she was popular in the institutions because the kings that the Old Testament editors find the good kings, I'm air quoting for you people who are listening to this, the so-called good kings, in particular, there are three. It's Asa, but in particular Hezekiah and Josiah.
Mm-hmm.
Two of the things they do is they destroy Asherah. What David doesn't say that? Well, it does. The King James hides Asherah because it translates the name Asherah as groves whenever it appears. So 2 Kings 18:4, and it is Hezekiah cuts down the grove. 2 Kings 23, Josiah drags the grove out of the temple and burns it and smashes it or grinds the ashes into the Kidron Brook.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the quote unquote good kings destroy the evidence in the temple of the mother. Okay. We know she was also popular at other levels. There's lots of stuff. So there's something called the Judean pillar figurines. There are thousands of them. They are the size of action figures. They are little clay statuettes, which have the head and upper body of a woman. Okay, so this is a breasted figure.
Mm-hmm.
She has very large eyes, typically, which is interesting, suggesting perception or insight. Okay, and then her lower body is just a column, and the common observation is that this is the trunk of a tree, so it must be Asherah. Now, not everybody thinks that, but this is the overwhelming consensus at this point. So the Judean pillar figurine, by the way, these are said to be uniquely and characteristically Judahite, meaning the countries around Judah did not have these. Okay, this is like specific to the kingdom of Judah. This is does not appear to be a borrowed religion, a foreign influence. This appears to be Judah's divine mother. And she is a nourishing mother, and she is also a tree. Okay? Which fits exactly what Nephi is describing, right?
Right.
The virgin with the child who is a tree. So Israel had by the way, I said let me clarify this comment. I said Nephi and Lehi both pun on the name Asherah. Well, we can't know that for sure because we only have the English text. But I think it's very likely. Now, let me give you, obviously, we should probably quote Proverbs 3 here. So let me pull up Proverbs 3 and I will point out what's in Proverbs 3. And then we can jump and see how this sort of surprisingly shows us what is probably in 1 Nephi 8 and 11. So Proverbs 3, it's very common for scholars. This is verses 13 to 18. Again, everybody believes that Israel had a goddess. Okay, everybody believes that by the end she had fallen out of favor.
So what you mean by everybody, you're saying any scholar that has studied the history of ancient Israelites.
If you go ask the most intense evangelical, they will still say yes, there was a goddess. Okay.
Right.
Where they will differ is they'll say, but she was bad. Right. She was foreign and evil. That's the debate, right? There's no debate that there was this goddess Asherah and that she was very popular. The debate is, what does she mean? Right. Was she indigenous? Now, Mark Smith and other scholars, I think the common view is, well, she was indigenous, and over time, she got absorbed into Yahweh. Now,
when you say indigenous, what do you mean? I don't understand what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's a good question. What I mean is, it was not a foreign cult that came in from the Phoenicians.
Okay. She was not adopted from the Canaanite pantheon, because there's also an Asherah, mother god, in the Canaanite pantheon, right?
Because what we have in the Old Testament, okay, is the record compiled at the end. It's the record of the southern kingdom, so it tends to be bigoted against the north. It's the urban record, right? And it's the record of one religious group. So we're getting a very specific view,
Right.
right? So sometimes when the book of Deuteronomy is talking about Canaanites, and if there are Canaanites worshiping Canaanite gods among you, you should kill them. It doesn't really mean Canaanites, probably. It probably just means people who are worshiping differently from you, righteous people who only know Yahweh, right? And so that so-called Canaanite might just be someone who has not forgotten the same mother, father, son that their ancestors have been worshiping for hundreds of years. So rather than you're asking a good question, there are big answers out there.
History is super complicated, and it's not a simple answer.
It's not a simple answer.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Okay.
So I will say, like in Genesis 49, however you date that, okay, however old you think Genesis 49 is, and what it is recounting is Israel blessing all of his sons. Okay, so it's supposed to be as they're before Egyptian exile, right? So it's kind of the beginning of Israel as we can see it. There's a mother and a father and a son. Now,
the blessing of the womb and the breast, is that the one you're talking about?
That is part of what I'm talking about. That is the passage one. Yeah, Genesis 49, it's like verses 22 to 26 is the blessing to Joseph. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, okay? But the verse that the phrase that you're talking about is verse 25. So you and your descendants, Joseph, shall be blessed even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that coucheth beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. Now, Mark Smith's comment, Ugarit scholar, is the breasts and the womb is a title of Asherah at Ugarit. And so he says, Shaddai will give you the blessings of Asherah. And so he says, Shaddai is Asherah. The Israelites knew Asherah. She was the wife, the consort, the wife, the female companion of El.
Really quick, I understand Shaddai means God with breasts.
I'm going to get there.
And that it has been translated into Almighty in our text. And I just want to clarify that for our listeners in case they didn't know that already. Okay. I feel like most probably know that, but maybe there's a few that haven't heard.
Well, so let's talk about that. So Almighty, every time you see Almighty in the King James Old Testament, it is translating the name Shaddai. Now, we'd have a long conversation about this. Let me have a short conversation. I think Shaddai probably means the breasted God. Why? Because that's a way to read it. Shad is a breast, and this is some Hebrew grammar. We'll start a Hebrew 101 right now. Objects in Hebrew that come standard in pairs, like hands, feet, or breasts, they don't have a plural form. They have a dual form. And the ending for the dual form is aim. So the word breasts here is shadaim. So one, I think Shaddai looks like it means the breasted God. Two, elsewhere, like Genesis 17, a couple more times in Genesis, Shaddai gives blessings of fertility. Okay. And three, in this passage, the author is punning on the name. Again, it's puns. Okay, you can't get away from puns in the Hebrew Bible, because what this says is you'll be blessed by the God of your father and by Shaddai. So that appears to be different from the El of your father, right? You're blessed by El and by Shaddai, question mark, the breasted one, with what? The blessings of Shaddaim, breasts, and the womb. So it looks like Israel knew from very early a mother and a father and a son. Over time, consolidated them all into one. This is why later in Israel's history, you get some very frantic writing saying, there is only one God. There is only one God. It's because that had not been true, actually, right? You're trying to persuade people something that has not been true. So, all right. So we got sidetracked. Uh,
Yeah, we
okay, let's
did.
get back in.
Well, I think at this point I feel like I need to do a little bit of a summary of what I understand of what you
Cool. Then I'll
shared.
show you Proverbs 3
Because
and First Nephi 8 and 11.
okay. So basically you started with Solomon's temple and you said that Solomon's temple leads to a dark place into a cave, which I think is very interesting because there are a lot of other texts in like Japan, for instance, the goddess goes into a cave. Persephone goes into a cave. There's a lot of cave spiritual texts that talk about like a descent into a dark place, right? And then you talk about all these other texts that are temple literature that lead to a place of light. And even our temples lead to progressively to a place of more light. And at the center of these texts is the tree of life. And interesting, maybe those examples come after Jesus Christ comes. So maybe possibly in my mind, what I'm interpreting from that is that there was that maybe there's two different ways to receive wisdom, or maybe there's two different types of temple journeys that we can take. One that goes into darkness and then one that brings us back into light. Maybe we need both in our life to be able to fully. This is just my own thoughts because I'm connecting other ideas like, for instance, like the story of Anana, who descends into the underworld, into darkness and dies and then comes back up into heaven as like a new embodied, fully initiated being. So kind of an interesting thought. I don't know if they have connections, but I like to connect dots and weave threads from all traditions, and that's kind of my thing. It's my favorite thing to do, but also they could not be connected in any way. And so then you're talking about, now you're kind of giving us a summary of Eve being connected to the tree of life and also connected to Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene kind of embodying Eve or being like Eve and Adam. We are also told in the temple to embody Eve and Adam and be like them. And so there is a pattern there as well that we can learn about. And then we're learning about the history of Asherah in the Old Testament and all these interesting things about ancient Israelites and the way that things have been told and how that history isn't exactly maybe how it was, and breaking open these really interesting things about goddess worship in ancient Israel. So, is that a good summary of what you've kind of shared with us so far?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Okay.
Yes. One of the challenges is you kind of have to get in, see the confusing whirl of stuff around you, and keep looking at it and working with it until you see the order. And we're not done yet. We have a lot to say. And the goal is not to leave people feeling like they're in a confusing whirl. The goal is, by the end, something people to feel like, oh, I am okay. Like I see what's going on.
Right. But it takes a full picture view. It takes multiple texts. It takes even looking outside of the tradition to be able to see with clarity what is going on.
This is why Satan is the god of social media and TED Talks. Because if you insist that knowledge is all learnable, that dumb Sam Bankman-Fried, shortly before he was arrested, had this tweet where he said, anyone who writes a book is a fool. Nothing worth knowing should take longer than a blog post. Well, that is the boast of a moron. Okay. You cannot understand this stuff in a tweet or in a TED Talk. This is slow knowledge. And so part of the thing I'd take advantage of, and we're not there yet, we'll get there, is people's own experience. So your temple experience that you've already had is going to be a big key to evaluating and understanding all the stuff that we're talking about.
Right.
Okay.
And also our information and knowledge of the Book of Mormon, taking that as a lens to look back on the Old Testament. What is the Book of Mormon saying different than the Old Testament? And what does that project onto that? And then also historically and archaeologically, what is going on in that area that we can pick up on that also tells us the story and kind of gives us hints towards what the Old Testament is saying.
The reason why I wanted to start with the celestial room is because I think it's a completely unappreciated sign of the authenticity of the restoration. First of all, like, why should Joseph have present? Joseph could read Kings, right? Was he, if he was, when he was going to make a temple, he could have gone in there and said, "Well, this is clearly the layout, and the back room is dark." And so I'm clearly the high priest, so I will just go in there myself once a year. Everybody else can stay out, right? That'd be easy to do. He didn't do that. He presented a different order, right? And the fact that that order lines up with, and we didn't get to talk about the changes to the temple in King Hezekiah's day and why I think that Isaiah was a witness and an objecting witness to them. The fact that Joseph presented an order that lined up squarely with one side of the sort of schism, I think is a mark of authenticity, but B, maybe I think that is sort of maybe the way forward isn't textual, right? Like maybe the way forward is the temple experience, and the spiritual experiences that temple maps out for us. Maybe
Exactly.
the way
It's more about living it than just like reading it or even going to the temple and experiencing it. I think it's taking those things, kind of like Megan Farner talks about, and applying them to our lives on a daily basis. So,
right. So maybe that's maybe that's a takeaway. People are listening to this and they're like, "Oh my gosh, Dave talked about like 4 different passages where there are Hebrew puns. I'm never going to learn Hebrew. The restoration is a dead end. It's only a thing for Hebrew scholars." Maybe the takeaway is to say, okay, let me start with the idea that the tree of life is what is in the celestial room, and that what is being mapped out here is my journey and the instruction, the great instruction that I came from Eden, and I'm going back. I'm going back in a new and better form because I will have learned the lessons of this life. Um, and that tree, there is reason to think. You don't have to look. You don't have to catch the Asherah puns in First Nephi 8 and 11. You can just read First Nephi 11. What is what is the tree? The tree that is white and beautiful is the virgin that is white and beautiful, that is the mother of the Lord, right? It is the tree of life. It is a divine woman that is the mother of Yahweh. So I think if you just start with that, you say Dave said a lot of stuff. I can't capture it all. Start with that, and think about it, pray about it, engage in your spiritual life.
mhm.
I think maybe that is the way forward. It cannot be the case that you have to know Hebrew to get to the celestial kingdom, right? Like that cannot be the answer.
Absolutely. And I will say that um I think these temple ceremonies, the way to the most sacred, they were made to be hidden and hard to understand for a reason for that time period. But we don't live in that time period anymore. And
I think
yeah, I think that there is something changing in the air, and it is definitely connected to the divine feminine, people having personal experiences with her. There are thousands of stories of women and men experiencing personal experiences with the divine feminine that are sacred in nature. And so, yes, it was secretive and coded and hidden. And I don't think that that applies so much today. We probably have
it's interesting.
evolved enough as humankind to reach, or we've reached maybe a point where there's new light and knowledge to be brought forward and not so hidden, and for us to just embrace and live too. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that if you read like Second Kings 23, like I think in specifically in Lehi's youth, but I think generally in the time of Lehi and Nephi in Jerusalem, going around and saying things like, "Hey, remember how the tree of life is the mother of Yahweh, who you like so much, got you killed." And so that was, I think for them, it was yes, the most precious thing. That's what Nephi says explicitly, First Nephi 11.
Mm-hmm.
But also it was a dangerous secret. And I think when Nephi is talking about it, he feels like he is shouting and like it should be so obvious. Do you not get it? Look what I am showing you. Yes, right. So I think when the angel shows him the tree, he says, I behold, that is the tree precious above all. Meaning Nephi already knew,
Right.
right? Nephi immediately recognized. I don't think he really had this vision and was like, oh, I think the vision is for our benefit. I think he's trying to show us, and look, see, this is what my father's talking about. And I
Mhm.
think he feels like he is shouting from the rooftops. Um, and the sort of uh, 2 a.m. dorm question. Hey man, when you're dead, if you wanna, who would you go talk to first or whatever, right? Like, I have questions for two people, and they are Nephi and Isaiah. Okay. And this I would want to talk to him about this, right? Like, were you surprised it took us so long to figure out what you were talking about? Were you surprised that we went for almost 200 years kind of saying, yeah, there's no real temple in the Book of Mormon.
Longer than that. I mean, well, yes. Okay. 200 years for the Book of
Yeah,
Mormon, but are you surprised that it took us longer than 2,000 years after Christ was
yeah,
dead? And his, gospel was kind of scattered and then I would think manipulated, but parts still contained. Like even if you just had the Old Testament and the New Testament and you were willing to look at it through a divine feminine lens, you could still pick it up, even without the Book of Mormon. You could still pick up
100%.
that, like, you could still pick up that there's a divine woman in there.
This is, by the way, maybe my next writing project is to try to do a version of In the Language of Adam that has no Mormonism in it. Just like, if I'm going to present this to straight up Christians,
Mhm.
can I do that? I think the answer is yes.
I think you
Um,
can, especially if you are willing to pull in some apocrypha that's somewhat accepted.
yeah, that is the challenge, right? This is one of the things I do with the language of Adam is to say, hey, because in the same way, it can't be the case that like you need to know Hebrew to go to heaven. It can't be the case that like it just feels very dispiriting, I think, to some people in the pews if you're like, if you look at the apocalypse of Isaiah, and they're like, what? Right? If it's not in the scriptures, can it be true? So this is one of my design goals of In the Language of Adam is to say, like, look, I want to show you this from the Book of Mormon,
Mhm.
right? That is all you need. But then yes, you're exactly right. The next level challenge is you pull the Book of Mormon out, oof, and some of the answer is I will. I'm going to look at some of the apostolic fathers, like First Clement, in particular, but also the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas are actually pretty good at having some of this stuff. When you have this lens, it's interesting. Some books you look at and you're like, man, this book is garbage. It doesn't say anything. I mean, this person's trying hard, but like they don't have it, right?
Yeah.
They don't get it. And then some of them you're like, oh, yep, there it is.
Yeah.
This person knows what he's talking about. Ding, ding,
Mhm.
ding, ding. Um, Also the Dead Sea Scrolls. So a place where this stuff is surprisingly huge is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Do I have it here? There's a great study edition, 2 volumes of the Dead Sea Scrolls that has the Hebrew on one page and an English translation on the other. So you can read it and be like, oof, what word do they have for wisdom here? Bam. And you can go look, right?
Mhm.
And I'm rereading that and I'm going to use that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's my plan to try and say, I think you can see this stuff without the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Um,
Have you heard of, I will have to send you a link to it. There is a story that is an apocryphal text of
mhm.
a man who has a vision of a tree of life.
There's
I
more than
think
one
it's
of those. There's one of those.
Zenith or something like that. Does that ring
So
in?
you're talking about Zosimus?
Zosimus, yes.
Yeah, the narrative of Zosimus. There's also one in Enoch. So Enoch in First Enoch has a scene that's surprisingly similar to First Nephi 11 because an angel presents him the tree of life with a kind of "what is that?" dialogue, which makes me think that what Nephi was showing us is actually like part of a ritual, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, but narrative of Zosimus. Yeah, the trick will be do as much as I can with the straight New Testament so that like a Catholic reader can read it and be like, oh my gosh, right? But I will be quoting some of those texts. I avoided that in the language of Adam on purpose. I will be doing some of that.
Yeah, that's exciting. I'm excited for you.
Yeah.
I'm
The goal.
also in the process of trying to write a book.
Ooh,
And
what about?
just I want it to be a really simple narrative of finding
Okay.
Heavenly Mother in Scripture. Um, just understanding her names for the most basic beginner,
Yeah.
not something complicated, something that anyone could pick up and they could be like all of a sudden seeing her in the scriptures wherever they're reading.
Yeah, I hear that.
And it's the book, honestly, that I've been searching for 4 years and never could find. And so I'm just like, now that I feel like I've kind of arrived and understand things a lot better, I feel like I need to provide that for people so that they don't have to search for years and years and years and pick up little things here and there and here and there.
I would like you to succeed in the project. It sounds great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Believe it or not, this is not the end of my conversation with Dave Butler. We went on for another 2 hours talking about temple literature. This is really just the start of our journey. Every time Scripture shares shrouded, ceremonial temple allegories, they always hold the tree at the center or the pinnacle. For example, the Garden of Eden is a 3-part space where Adam and Eve officiate as priest and priestess, with the tree of life at the center. The vision of the tree of life in the Book of Mormon is also a coded temple allegory, with a 3-part space that also ends with the tree of life. If you would like to learn more about the Book of Mormon and temple literature, please read Dave Butler's new book that just came out called In the Language of Adam. It's incredible. I finished it. He also has 2 other books about temple literature and how there is temple literature in the Book of Mormon. So if you've ever wondered if it's there, but not sure if you're seeing it, it is there, and he does an excellent job breaking that open to help you see it there. In next week's episode, Dave will break into Matthew 5, which contains the Sermon on the Mount, and he will talk about how it is also a temple ceremony that in all reality leads to the tree of life. This episode is the beginning of a series that I've been working on. So for the next few weeks, we will be talking about the temple, restoring truths about the divine feminine, and corruption that has happened historically connected to the divine feminine, and how we can avoid creating corrupt fruit as we seek to understand more about Heavenly Mother. So, I hope you're excited about the next few weeks, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your family and friends. We are also looking for people to help support our podcast so that we can pay for all the subscriptions that make this podcast possible. Our team at In Her Image are all volunteering their hours of work that we do to bring these episodes to you. This is truly an unprofitable venture for us, but we do feel like it's worth our time and effort. If you feel like it's been worth your time to listen to our podcast, please consider making a one-time donation or subscribing to our podcast for as low as $1 a week. We so appreciate everyone here with us on this journey.